What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video on our newest companion in Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, who was added in with the beta that just recently launched at the beginning of June. And while I mentioned him in my overview, I did want to talk a little bit more specifically about him as a character and what he brings to the battlefield currently, because our newest companion, Ulfar, is actually a Space Marine. That is to say, a genetically enhanced super soldier of the grim dark future, and not just any Space Marine, a Space Wolf. But seeing how we get a Space Marine as a companion and how significantly stronger they are compared to essentially everyone else, I thought it would be interesting to talk about their role in combat, as well as how that's sort of balanced against everything else. But to start at the beginning, and what it takes to actually recruit Ulfar, you'll come into contact with him as part of the main story in Chapter 3. I don't want to go full spoilers here, obviously, but that is when he's available. He can't really be missed. And not just because Space Marines are 10-foot tall mountains. That said, what we have access to in the beta puts Ulfar with us for just the last few fights. We do not have much of the beta left by the time he comes into our party, and unfortunately that means we don't get a chance to talk a terribly large amount about his abilities and motives, but it is enough to give you some background. Now, in many ways, I would say Ulfar is a sort of standard representation of what you would expect from the Space Wolf Legion of Space Marines, as they are one of the more notable legions or types of Space Marines out there, though it's worth mentioning that these days they go by chapters rather than legions. That said, as the name might imply, they have a certain feral characteristic that makes them especially aggressive in melee-oriented combat. However, this comes from splicing their DNA with that of a canine species native to their homeworld. And that sort of mutation can lead to problems known as the Curse of the Wolfen. That is to say that space wolves who cannot manage to contain their feral nature ultimately sort of mutate into a more off-brand type of werewolf called Wolfen, and in a world where mutants are not treated kindly, that's not exactly a great thing. Ulfar here is simply no exception. One of the key characteristics, it would seem, for his character is that he is struggling to maintain himself against the Curse of the Wolfen, so I imagine that will probably be much of the hallmark around his character progression and development as we continue the story. But as of right now, that's just speculation, though he does mention it in his own dialogue. As for what he is doing in the Coronis Expanse, where the game takes place, it would seem he was called here by a Lord Inquisitor, who is also part of the game, and we can have a conversation with that Inquisitor that tells us he called a certain amount of Space Wolves to the Coronis Expanse to help keep the peace, so to speak, one of which would be presumably Ulfar, but the nature by which we encounter him leaves some questions unfulfilled, as Chapter 3 takes place in a less friendly environment, to put it very kindly. But Ulfar, much like pretty much all Space Wolves, is seeking to make a name for himself. As an organization, Space Wolves, compared to other Space Marines, are very much so about their own personal glory and trying to build their own heroic deeds and things like that. They are very much so the Viking culture of Space Marines. A lot of Nordic stuff going on there. As an example, they refer to the God Emperor of mankind as the Allfather. So with all of that said, I think it's safe to say that Ulfar will likely be in our crew, or at least permitted to continue with our crew at the behest of the Lord Inquisitor, as part of the game's broader narrative around rooting out cultists, while very much so likely struggling against his own nature at the same time, because the Curse of the Wolfen is something that the Space Wolves will struggle with their entire lives from the second that they begin their initiation, and could potentially take centuries for them to succumb to. From there, let's talk about a few other interesting things, such as what Ulfar will do for us in combat and how that will work. So right off the bat, Ulfar, as a Space Wolf, is a very melee-oriented character, and his starting stats reflect that. He has very high toughness, strength, weapon skill, which is our melee skill, on top of our physical skills such as athletics. And while his other stats are average to say the least, his physical stats are incredibly high, especially compared to other characters we might have. Because while we might be able to specialize a character into one thing higher than him here, him having the weapon skill, toughness, and strength all in the 70s is something that would be impossible for any other character. That, combined with his doctrines or his classes of Fighter and Vanguard, makes him very well suited for being a melee tank. Now, unfortunately, in the beta, we don't have, I would say, a full example of his abilities just yet, simply because he only has the equipment that he has right when we get him, which is not much. But simply given his sort of baseline stats, we could easily, with equipment, morph him into an incredibly imposing melee character. And speaking of imposing, Ulfar, unlike the rest of our companions, will take up a 2x2 square in all of our combat encounters, obviously to signify how much larger he is than everyone else, which is something he will share alongside many smaller boss enemies. However, one thing I am curious about here is if they'll wind up changing his class after they add the rest of the classes in come full launch, because we're not dealing with everything available there here in the beta, so I'm curious if we'll see any changes between now and release. But as it stands, he makes a very formidable tank for the last few battles of the game. In particular, I found that his counterattacks were especially vicious. However, his sheer size made him difficult to maneuver in certain areas, which may or may not be intentional. Now, as for how it feels playing a Space Marine amongst a party of mere mortals, I would say currently it feels fine, and that's largely down to the fact that we are regularly fighting against threats that a Space Marine would be utilized against, such as various Xenos races or demonic threats, and while it's too early to say with absolute certainty, it does seem like he will be an appropriate addition to our party, especially since, as with his baseline stats, he has the potential to get very overpowered if you were to build him correctly with a certain degree of equipment. Now, how much of that equipment is going to be customizable or other options or limitations we might not know about yet, because again, our exposure to him in the beta is very limited, we have yet to see. As it stands though, very cool companion to add into the game. And probably what I'm excited for most is seeing how well he gets along with the rest of our companions, some of which are definitely people he will want to murder. Unfortunately, we don't get to see a ton of those interactions in the beta either, but his potential in combat and his potential interactions with other characters are what I'm excited about learning more about this guy with the most, which sadly in the beta is a bit lacking. That, however, I think is going to wrap it up for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed this look at Ulfar, our Space Wolf companion, as part of Rogue Trader here, but by all means, like, comment, subscribe, tell me how you feel about it down in the comment section below. Though regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.